Hey everybody, how you doing? So this is Mark Staten, and I'm speaking to you from my office in the basement of Parks Hall, which is a part of Western Washington University's main campus. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people who lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. So the MBA program and the Western Washington University Alumni Association are incredibly excited to welcome you to today's WWU Thought Leaders webinar, WWU MBA Thought Leaders webinar, Creating and Sustaining an Inclusive Workplace Climate. Our speaker today is Dr. Sue Gunther Schlesinger, and she most recently served as Special Assistant to the Provost for Education and Development here at Western Washington University, where she was here for 17 years. In this role, she provided leadership on strategic initiatives concerning accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her efforts included managing Western's diversity and inclusion hiring initiative, conducting search committee and implicit bias trainings for leadership, faculty, and staff, developing and facilitating executive leadership training in areas of equal opportunity and social justice, and conducting individual, organizational, and campus climate assessments with respect to ADEI issues. And I got to know Dr. Sue because she taught in our MBA program, and she taught an excellent course before she retired. And now that she's retired, she is doing some private consulting as well. So a little housekeeping before we dive in. So some of you have submitted questions with your registration, and we really appreciate those, and we'll definitely get to those. If there's something that comes up now, because this is a webinar, that what you want to do is you want to go down here in the bottom right here, and you see Q&A, and type your question in there, and then I'll sort of help facilitate those discussions with Dr. Sue once we get past her presentation part of it. So like I said, we'll be responding to those questions during the later part of the webinar, which is our Q&A session. And we will do our best to answer as many as we're able to during our time today. We also recommend that you use the speaker view as part of Zoom, because we've got some slides, and then you can really focus on Dr. Sue. And without any further ado, I'd like to hand it off to my good friend, Dr. Sue Gunther Schlesinger.
Thank you so much, Mark, and welcome everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're all very busy people to be part of this exciting webinar. I also really want to thank Dr. Staten, who Mark's been a great colleague and a friend over the years, and I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you. And also thank Janine Bankston, who is been the technical expertise behind this program. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to be talking with a number of slides on this important topic. You're welcome to take a few notes as you think about questions you might want to ask at the end of this period. And then we'll go over and Mark will be moderating those questions. So thank you again for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides. So here we go. I like to always add something before I begin any kind of diversity and inclusion training, because I think that sometimes these words aren't spoken enough. I just want to acknowledge, and hopefully have you acknowledge, that we're all at different points in this journey toward ADEI, accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that needs to be recognized, just spoken simply, remembering to have respect for everyone, to have grace and forgiveness and humility, because we're not all at the same place on this road as we head toward increased and enhanced equity and fairness and inclusion for everyone. And I think in a world that's become very, very polarized, this is a great way to start a webinar like this. Let me just give you a big, 10,000, 30,000 foot overview of what we're looking at for this evening. When you're talking about creating an inclusive workshop climate, it really involves two large pieces. The first is to do your own self-assessment. And that would be an examination of our own, and we all have this implicit bias, or sometimes referred to as unconscious bias, and how to mitigate its negative impact. And while this webinar is not going to dive deep into the issue of implicit bias, I just wanted to point out that that's an important step. And if you're interested in this topic, you might want to delve into that a little bit more yourself if you haven't already. Many of you may already have a great understanding of that. So we're going to focus tonight now on the organization part of the assessment. And that's examining our own organization's bias and how to do two things. One, develop an infrastructure to keep it going. There's so many great efforts that go on, but sometimes without an infrastructure, it's not sustainable. And the other thing is how to use an inclusion lens. And what does that mean? And to have that inclusion lens really as a normal part of how we operate and go through our daily routine as an organization, whatever kind of work we're in. And I'm not going to read all of these outcomes for the webinar because as you registered, I believe you saw these posted. But basically, we're going to be reviewing in the first part something called the Multicultural Organizational Development Model. This is a great model developed a number of years ago by Bailey Jackson, Rita Hardiman, and some others then. Got other authors and researchers got very involved with this, but it's one of a number of tools, and I think a very good one, to at least start out and begin to really ask yourself and ask your colleagues and get together and use some type of assessment tool. Where are we as an organization? Can we agree approximately where we fall on a scale so we know where we need to be going, and then we can build out how we get there. And then secondly, how to understand how we can empower our employees, how we can build capacity by looking at the infrastructure, who's going to do this work. We never have enough money for this kind of work. Some organizations have no position for this kind of work. Well, how do we get this done? And then how do we gain skills in using an inclusion lens, and what does this mean? So without further ado, you can see this laid out in the terms of our agenda at the end of the question and answer period, moderated by Dr. Staten. And we'll begin with the MCOD model. So really the purpose of this model, or the goal of this model, is to be able to assess your organization so that collectively you can see where you are, so you can understand where you need to go if you want to enhance your ADEI efforts, and if you want to build toward a more enhanced inclusive environment in your organization. And sometimes we think that we know where we are, but oftentimes we don't talk to each other. So we need to recognize and value and maximize the benefits of diversity while we eliminate exclusion and inequality. And then we want to learn how to revise policies and programs and services so they're in line with our thinking. So we're all moving together on the same track toward the same goal. And we might be going at a little different speeds at times, but we're basically knowing what the endpoint or the outcome is we want to reach. And it really helps us be effective 21st century leaders. So if you take a look at this graphic, you can see it's a continuum. It goes from something called a monocultural status or rubric, which has a couple of different stages in it, to a fully multicultural organization. And I'm going to go through each of these so that you can better understand what this is. And then you can make a decision if you would like, just so you can see that again, if you would like to use this model to get together with colleagues, supervisors, employees throughout your organization and sit down and have a discussion about this. Just as a way of introducing this, Bailey Jackson, Rita Hardiman, and Evangelina Holvina talked about what an inclusive organization would look like. And you can see these 5 different bullets. And certainly it includes all members as active participants in decisions that shape the organization. And employees reflect diverse social and cultural groups. This is where you get to that point, that penultimate point of what inclusiveness means. And it means acting on your commitment, not just talking your talk, but as they say, walking your talk acting on your commitment to eliminate all forms of exclusion, discrimination within the organization. That includes things like classism, ableism, religious oppression, and certainly discrimination based on all the protected characteristics. So the first stage of the multicultural organization development model is something called exclusionary, because it really is the beginning of an organization that hasn't yet understood the value of diversity. And it openly maintains a privileged group's power and privilege and deliberately restricts its membership. So we hope we don't have too many organizations like this, but in these organizations that really haven't come to understand the value of diversity, and we could have a whole conversation on diversity, because while we know that work toward diversity aims at redressing discrimination that has been historical against certain protected groups, people of color, women, and so on, people with disabilities, people of certain ages, religions, and national origins, and other groups. We know that we've come an awful long way, but there still are some organizations that are really just that monocultural organization, and it's just who we are, and we don't let anybody in. And then the spectrum kind of moves down the line to what's called the club. It really still maintains the privilege of those who have traditionally held power and influence, and it has norms that go along with its monocultural nature and procedures that really are procedures of a privileged culture. So things in that organization are viewed by employees, by leadership, as this is the right way to do business, and this is business as usual, and questions aren't really entertained about maybe we need to be looking at a broader picture, maybe we need to be looking at a more inclusive picture. There may be a limited number of what we would call token members from other social identity groups allowed in, but only if they have the right credentials, if they fit into the structure of that club. And that club then, again, is dominated by people who maintain privilege in a rather monocultural way. It's an organization that engages issues of diversity and social justice, but only on the club members' terms and within their comfort zone. They're not poking out, not taking the challenge, not reaching out to see how they can be more inclusive. Then we move on down that spectrum and we come to something called the compliance organization. Now, the compliance organization starts to get interested in making sure that that organization is free of discrimination. It may have a viable equal opportunity office. It may have viable policies that protect people in the workplace based on employment discrimination laws. It does provide access to some members of previously excluded groups, but there's not really any change in the overall organizational culture or mission. It's really more compliance. And there may be even efforts to change the profile of the kind of workforce. Is there diversity among the members of who's employed in this organization from the bottom of the organization, but all the way up to the top? And in this organization, you must be a team player, you must be qualified. And what does qualification mean and how is that based? And sometimes it's based on the dominant group. So this compliance organization has moved a little further than the previous two stages, but it's not yet what we might call inclusive. Then you move to stage 4, you're a little further down this road here and the spectrum of inclusiveness for an organization. And it really has to do with an organization now coming out more fully and demonstrating commitment to eliminating discrimination and all of the policies, practices, and so on, to acknowledging privilege, to actively recruiting and promoting members of groups, and even supporting them and providing career development opportunities to a wide variety of individuals, and to recognize people who have been historically denied access and opportunity. But still in all, it hasn't quite reached the penultimate stage 6. So in this organization, even though it's gone down the spectrum quite a bit, it's still in organizations where employees really are expected to assimilate into the organizational culture. Then we move to stage 5, which some researchers and academicians in this field really believe some of the most highly functioning organizations that have shown through their actions and through their policies, procedures, practices, and services that they really are an inclusive organization. Many of the researchers feel that organizations have a very hard time going past 5 because 5 really is a very proactive type of organization. This is an organization that continuously tries to develop and transition. So it's open to change. And that's a very big, important part when you look at how to enhance your organizational climate. It moves beyond compliance, where we're concerned with non-discriminatory, which is very important, but it moves beyond that to proactively equitable and inclusive issues. And it actively makes significant progress toward creating environments that capitalize on diversity. So you're seeing some initiatives come out, and you're making progress to ensuring full inclusion for all members. And you're seeing that in the form of initiatives, policies, procedures, and so on. This is a culture unlike the earlier ones we talked about, where you're expected to question, you're expected to reach out, you're expected to see how do you get to the next step and to ask that question, expected to know what that next step is and where you're headed. And so it really is very empowering to employees in redesigning and implementing their policies and practices and services and programs and all that their organization represents. And this is a highly functioning organization that, again, moves out from these other 4 stages into something much more highly functional. And then you get to the final stage of where Jackson and Hardiman feel this is called the multicultural organization. This is where their mission, values, operations, and services truly reflect the contributions and interests of a wide diversity of cultural and social identity groups. And just in that one bullet, you might ask, well, how do we know if it does that? It's because it's an organization that asks their employees, what do they think? How do they feel? How do they experience life on the job? It's an organization that has leaders and members act on their commitment to eradicate, not just have a grievance procedure, which of course is required by law for organizations that have 15 or more employees, but how do we really work proactively and intentionally to eradicate all forms of discrimination, unfairness, inequity, and so on? It has members belonging to a wide variety of identity groups. This is an organization that has found some way to diversify its workforce in a fair and equitable way through search processes that are informed toward that end, and actively works also in larger communities, even sometimes national, international forums, to eliminate all forms of discrimination and promote inclusion and carry on their own values outside of their own organization. So I think the message I'd like to leave with you before we move on to the next segment here is no matter where your organization is on the MCOD model, and I really do encourage you to get a hold of this rubric, and I'm happy to send it to you. I think you may already have received it or will be receiving it, but in any case, no matter where you are on the MCOD model, these are some things that have to be in place for you to keep in mind. There has to be leadership commitment. So some people talk about top-down kind of leadership efforts, and other people talk about bottom-up leadership efforts. With issues of ADEI, there must be leadership commitment and ownership around the development regarding ADEI efforts. That doesn't mean that we don't want the bottom-up and all employees throughout all organizations to be fully engaged with this issue. And in fact, it needs to happen that way because one person can't do this job. And then leaders need to have some type of ADEI infrastructure. So their efforts aren't just one-shot effort here and one program here and one initiative here, but a real plan of how can this be built in to the organization. That's what we're going to look at in the next segment. And the overall goal is to clarify the vision and end statement, because as I said before, sometimes when we don't spend time discussing this in all seriousness, or maybe if it's not in our strategic plan for our organization, one person thinks the end state is here and that the organization is here, and another person may think it's really not there, it's here. So part of this idea about getting your organization together, using this as an MCOD as an assessment tool, is so people can be working collectively and as a team. They may not agree 100% on every piece of where they are in the organization, but they can agree on what stage they most see themselves, or maybe they see themselves in between a couple of stages. It's also important, once you do this kind of assessment, that you assess your organizational climate, and that entails looking at policies, your practices, your procedures, and looking at them through an inclusion lens, which we'll talk about, and evaluating periodically. That doesn't mean every 10 years, but evaluating on a regular basis. Where have you come? Where have you moved? And do your policies and procedures and practices and services and programs and what makes up your organization, do they need to be revisited and looked at? So I hope you will think about the possibilities of what the MCOD model might bring to you as you may become more involved with trying to be part of these efforts. So we're going to take a breath, and we're going to go to part 2 of this particular presentation. And that has to do with building an infrastructure for accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then how do you use an inclusion lens, and what is an inclusion lens? Well, first of all, to build a type of infrastructure is to acknowledge that nobody can do this on their own, including not one office can do this on their own. Even offices that have their own equal opportunity office, their own chief diversity officer, and so on. It is a mission for all employees. And of course, the management, the leadership is very vital to that. But how do you do that in small organizations? How do you do that in organizations that don't have an equal opportunity office, or the EO office is one person embedded in a larger HR office and doesn't have the bandwidth to really do the work or to get others involved with the work, let alone empower all employees to have that opportunity? So we'll take a look at that and how can we use an inclusion lens? And that means as we look at our policies and procedures and processes, what does that mean? What are we supposed to be looking for? How will we know that we need to improve or enhance what we already have? So we're going to talk about the first part of this, that's the infrastructure. And we're going to take a look at some work that was based on a national consultant by the name of Dr. Kathy Aubert. And she talks about developing an infrastructure where you have inclusion partners, where you have facilitators and trainers, and you have unit change teams. Now, if you're in a very small organization, if you're in an organization with 15 or 20 people, you may want to think flexibly about, are you going to have all 3 of these? Are you going to use one of these? Are you going to combine some of these different kinds of aspects of building your infrastructure? But this will give you an idea about what's possible, and then you can adapt it to whatever you think is best for your size and type of organization. So an inclusion partner is someone who really is a thought leader. So you want to find someone in the organization that may already have some understanding of ADEI issues and take advantage of the fact that they may have gone to trainings, they may have gone to trainings through their own organization, or they may have done it themselves because they're so very interested, or they may have had personal experience learning about issues of discrimination and how important inclusion is. Whatever it is, the purpose is to deepen the internal capacity of the organizational leader by having a thought partner for that leader. So you can designate at least one inclusion partner per organizational unit. That's if you have multiple units within a larger organization. So at a university, this might be colleges. At a different type of organization, business or industry, this could be different functions of an organization. Everybody has to decide what's best for their organization. And this inclusion partner works with the leader to prompt that leader, who's very busy, whether it's the CEO, the president, and so on, very busy running the entire organization. This is the person who prompts that leader to look at issues of inclusion, to conduct self-assessments, to help develop system-wide groups of inclusion partners. So if you're a multi-system type of organization, you can work across the system, and a percentage of their work might even be designated in their job description. And if one thought partner can't do that work on a part-time basis, depending on how many people you have in your organization, you might want to have a couple that are doing it together as a team, but rotating so that not everybody has that. One of the things that have come up in this work is that some people who know a little bit more about inclusion sometimes are expected to do this on top of their regular job. So it's very important as you talk through how you would like to identify your inclusion partners to make sure that these people have even a little tiny bit of this written into their job description, or in some other way recognized or and acknowledged for the work that they do. And just to go on with inclusion partners, thought partners, they could provide tools, they could provide readings, they could facilitate peer coaching discussions, and they can help train trainers. And we're going to get to the trainers right now. So why do we need trainers and facilitators to build out a structure and infrastructure for accessibility, diversity, equity, inclusion? We need that because not everybody, as I said in the very beginning, is in the same place on this road toward understanding and being able to process and talk and not be worried about talking or saying the wrong thing. We're in a very difficult time. As I said before, we have a lot of polarization. There are many people who are nervous about even talking about some of these issues because they're afraid of offending people. And it's really important when I say trainers, facilitators, I mean, you can use a different word. You can use group leader. You can use a focus group person. But to have someone bring people together in your organization to talk about what is diversity, what do we mean by these terms, can we get on the same page, how do we talk with each other about it, what's a common language to use, what are definitions, people throw out words, diversity, equity, equality, equal opportunity, what the heck do those mean, and how do we understand them together in order to do that kind of work. So one of the things some of the researchers have suggested, and Dr. Aubert has suggested, is that you recognize someone who's already done some training, even if it's not their job. They could be doing IT or something else in the organization, but they just like to do facilitation, or they've done some training for an outside of work group, and ask them if they would be willing to start to do some training on this type of subject. And again, depending on the size of your organization, your financial resources, this is a job that could be shared. It could be part of an HR function where they might think about including this in some of the training, or it could be people who are interested in this and have the skills and knowledge and abilities to be able to periodically, as a shared endeavor, come together and hold these groups. So more people will be in the know. It won't just be one person here, one person there. It'll start to develop a culture, if you will, in your organization of how to do this work. And then there are unit change teams. And unit change teams really, at the beginning and end of it, end up being all of your employees at some ideal moment. These are people who, as they become trained, as the facilitators go out and training occurs and it's tailored to meet your needs and your organization, more and more people will become interested in this. And as more and more people become interested in this, then you can put together what might be called unit change teams. They could be called a different name as well, but they could be called a unit change team. And depending on if you have different units within your organization, you could have representatives from these unit change teams sort of come together in a leadership group of unit change team representatives and share information and help each other, and then go back out to their individual units and continue to be able to work with the facilitators, to continue to be able to work with the thought leaders who are working with the CEO or the president, to begin to be part of their own empowering to move toward a more inclusive organizational climate. So I know that's a lot of information, and we still have a short section to go before we break for questions and answers. So take a deep breath, and I would again encourage you, if you have a question, jot it down, and then we can try to be responsive at the end here. So the second part of this, sustaining this effort, one is to actually build these groups of people, and in a way, as I said, that works for your organization. But that's not the only thing that needs to happen if you want to sustain your diversity initiatives, your inclusion initiatives, so that they are not one-offs. They're not a seminar here, a workshop here, an initiative here. People maybe don't talk to each other who are doing this kind of work, but that you really develop something cohesive. In addition to getting the employees and the personnel organized in that way, we have to learn how to use an inclusion lens, meaning how do we look at recognizing and acknowledging differences in an intentional way in our organization? And how do we know if we're asking the right questions? And how do we explore intent and impact of these policies and procedures that we all think work just fine for us, but they may not work for everybody? And then what about our environment? Are there things on our walls or things on our computer that we're not even aware of, could not really be in line with what inclusion stands for? So we're going to take a quick look at this. We probably could spend the rest of the evening, or maybe the rest of tonight, talking about how important it is to recognize and acknowledge differences. And there are some, in the list of resources that I've sent, there are some articles that are very good that talk about differences, and I have some of them listed on this particular slide. But just take a look at this. So of course we have what are called protected characteristics: race, national origin, disability, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, age, and so on and so forth. But there are others, and they're protected status because there's discrimination laws, civil rights laws that protect people based on these categories from discrimination. And while we know certain particular groups, as I said before, have been discriminated historically, please keep in mind that those laws are for everyone, just like diversity includes everyone. But look on this page and see that there are other things about our backgrounds, our educational level, our level of literacy, our geographic region, and so on and so forth, that really shape our differences. And so listening to people's stories and acknowledging people's stories and identifying differences that we have in our organizations becomes very important, and honoring those differences. So using an inclusion lens in decision-making in any organization really requires that you ask questions, and you can take a look at these 7 questions here. First one of the most important ones, look around the conference table. Who do you see? Do you see people just like you? Are you the only one of a kind? Is there someone missing from the conversation? Is everyone talking and thinking the same? And very importantly, is everyone feeling comfortable? And is everyone participating? I'm sure you've all been to meetings where sometimes people tend to dominate the conversation, and sometimes they say things that don't really sound too good. Sometimes we think it could be bias or implicit bias. Well, how the heck do we interrupt that? And what could be the impact if we don't interrupt that, and so on? So using an inclusion lens is understanding what to ask, when to ask it, how to ask it, but you have to ask some questions when you're looking at your way you do business in your organization. But you also need to explore intent and impact. In other words, any decision you make, whether it's about a particular procedure or policy that covers your employees, or it's about a service or a program that you provide through your organization, what could be the reasonable intent behind the decision to take this program and do this with it? But what could there be possibly an unintentional negative impact that sort of says to some group stop, or puts up barriers or gates? It says, nope, this isn't for you. Even if we didn't intend it, even if we have a lot of goodwill, how can you start to sort that out and think about how to develop policies that don't have that in them? So when you review your policies and programs and services with an inclusion lens, you need to be asking, what do we already have in place? There are some people, because it's not their job, they're an employee, they're not HR, they're not equal opportunity. They may not even know what policies exist, but it's important to know in the organization you work in, what's already in place. And to ask the question, what might be useful? Do I see something missing? Could we add something? And what other ideas might be good? Or other innovative possibilities? Does it really cover everybody? Would there be somebody from a different group who could feel excluded, who might not feel this policy is for them, even if that exclusion is unintentional? But it's also very, very important to scan your physical and virtual environment with this type of lens. So take a look around where you're working and ask yourself, do I have any? Of course, a lot of us are working at home. So when you go back to work, if you're not working in your office, ask yourself, do I have some office decorations or art that could be offensive to someone? Or maybe even the other way around. Do I intentionally put up some posters that show people who come into my office that I appreciate and value differences? Are there pamphlets or other materials on display that also have graphics that indicate that? What about the websites we use? When's the last time you took a look at your website to make sure that, again, even unintentionally, it's not leaving somebody out, or it's just showing one kind of group, or it's not offensive to someone? And, having said that, we can't always protect against offending somebody. We're just human. And that's why I said in the beginning of this presentation, there has to be room for grace and forgiveness in this kind of work. All of us, no matter where we are all trying to do our best. And so we're going to make mistakes. And as long as we understand we've made a mistake, we can say, apologize, I'm going to do better next time, but we're going to make mistakes. And that's okay, because that's what will bring you to the next level of not making mistakes. And how's your office set up? What if someone came into your office in a wheelchair or with some type of visual or hearing a disability, or for whom English is their second language? How would you deal with them? How would you communicate with them? Are you prepared for that? Is your organization prepared for that? So scan the environment and also conduct a scan. And this is an interesting one of how, because honestly, I don't think a lot of us, that's including myself at certain points in my career, how do we appear to others? What might people assume about our commitment to inclusion? What issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion would they assume you care about if they observed you in a meeting, or saw your office area, which we just talked about, or follow you on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram, or see you moving around the organization, or hear you talking? So think about, this is again part of your self-assessment, just like if you were to take the Harvard Implicit Association test to measure your implicit bias, you can do this type of scan of yourself as well. So the last couple of slides here. Well, what can we do in a general sense overall that could be recommended to get to that more inclusive organization? Well, clarify what's meant by multicultural competencies, and then what are those expected of your leaders, your supervisors, your employees. Of course, if you're a leader or a supervisor, there's going to be higher expectations to lead in that fashion. But everybody needs to be able to provide a service or a program or a product as they interact with people in a fair and equitable way, in a respectful way. And that doesn't mean everybody has to agree with everybody on everything at all. It just needs to be respectful and to acknowledge differences and honor them. And then you need to identify the leadership case for creating an inclusive, socially just organization. How are you going to sell this to the leadership? How's the leadership going to sell it to their board? Because you want to get your board, whoever that board is, or your higher level authority involved so they can be supportive. And then organizations need to assess the current state of their area, a climate survey, some kind of assessment that's passed out periodically to employees, even if it's a focus group where this is something that is notes are taken, but not names. Nobody is identified. And through this data collection, so to speak, that you do periodically, develop a shared vision together and develop an evidence-based shared diagnosis of the current state, of course, using the MCOD model if you want to use that as well. And then you'll understand how to expand your professional development opportunities for both leaders and staff and engage in what I would call authentic dialogue to enhance and deepen your awareness and skill building around ADEI issues. And collect and share promising practices, always a good thing to do. That doesn't mean because the institution or organization down the road has success in doing it this way, your organization will, but you can garner bits and pieces and then adapt it to who you are. And you can use that to revise your policies and programs and so on. And then just continuous improvement, which is always a really good thing. So that's a lot of information. I appreciate your patience. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Dr. Staten.
That's great. Thank you so much. I learned a ton, and and it's interesting because on the one hand, I'm a marketing strategy professor, and on the other hand, I'm director of the MBA program, and I definitely felt like there was a lot of things that you brought up, which I feel like we can implement within the MBA program to create a more inclusive environment. So this has been great for me personally, to listen to this. The first question I had was, you joined West. You were at Western for over 17 years, and you retired recently. The MCOD model, which I thought was really, really interesting. Where would you say Western was when you first got here, and where would you say it is now? And yeah, we're recording this, but don't worry about it. You're retired.
Yeah, we're recording this, right? 17 years is a long time ago. It's a long time ago, but I'd probably have to say, I'm just looking at my hard copy of the model so I can give you the exact title. I think we were probably somewhere between, I love Western. And I loved working at Western. I love continuing to do some teaching for Western. So this is not to be diminutive in any way, but I think we were really somewhere between 2 and 3. And we hadn't yet got to 4 way back when I came, which was a long time ago. And so 2005 is a long time ago. And I think there was a lot of good intention. It was enough good intention to hire someone, at that time I was the executive director for equal opportunity, then became the vice provost. But I can tell you that within 5 years of coming to Western, it really blew out, and it really expanded along that spectrum.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I will say that some of the personal growth that I've had around these areas as a professor really was a result of students, just coming up and being and giving me some tips on how I can be more inclusive in the classroom, and then and it's hard to hear that stuff, but I definitely do not want to be defensive about it. And I know for a fact that they've just brought up things that it really sort of comes back to this idea of sort of implicit bias, in that I didn't realize that the language I was using was exclusionary in a certain way. It was just the way that I talked. Right. And so to have students come to me and say, hey, can you sort of dial this back a little bit? Or, I'm really sort of having an issue with this, but they said it in such a sort of a genuine teaching way, and I took it in sort of a, wow, thanks, I appreciate that. I hope that there are other organizations where people can sort of have that dialogue and not get defensive, and I think that's a really important part.
Absolutely.
So we had a really good question from one of our attendees, And I won't say her name, but I will say you're getting extra credit in class this week because she's one of my weekend MBAs, and I'm very impressed that she did this. So how do you navigate other people's subconscious racial bias?
That's really an excellent question. I'm glad you're giving her extra credit for that, because that is a good question to ask. I'll just say this as a preface. If you haven't taken training or seen videos on implicit bias, there's a ton of stuff out there, and it would really be good to do that. I would refer you to look up Jerry Kang, K-A-N-G, and he has a number of YouTube videos. And if you look at UCLA and just type in diversity, 6 lessons in diversity by Jerry Kang, he works at UCLA. They will, there's like a really short set of animated video clips that he made that are really powerful on steps 1 through step 6. So having said that, there's so many dynamics about unpacking unconscious and implicit bias, and how do you navigate that, because there's so many people who are not approaching it intentionally, and it takes intentional work to override it. So the short version of the answer, because again, it's another one of these topics you could spend hours on, is that when someone says something that you hear and you kind of have your ears perked up and you go, oh my gosh, I don't believe that person said that, whether it's about race, whether it's about sexual orientation, whether it's about religion, and so on, then you have a couple of choices, and one of the things that's not a really great choice is to call someone out, because if you it's certainly your right to do that, but if you call, and maybe there are times when it's appropriate to do that, but if you're sitting around a table in an organization, you call someone out, you're probably going to alienate them. They'll become very defensive. So and it may not always be your goal, but if your goal is to bring people together and move forward, then here are some tips. Ask the person, I think I heard you say, and then repeat what they said. And then say, could you explain that a little bit more to me? I don't really understand that. And let the person try to explain that. And not to catch them up or foul them up, but so that they can hear themselves trying to explain something that's an assumption, because implicit bias is based on assumptions. It's based on our stereotypes that we've developed through our socialization process. And so, or can you unpack that a little further for me? Or we just worked as an organization on ADEI, and we want to make sure we're not making some assumptions if you're able to do this. I will say that depending on your status in the organization, this can be a very scary thing because of power differential, but there are ways of doing this professionally and politely by asking people to explain, what did you mean by that? Because when they explain it, lo and behold, somebody else around the table may say, oh, well, I think such and such. What about looking at it this way? And so that's one way to try to navigate it. Diffuse it. Don't make the person defensive, because they probably will be. But if you don't speak up, we know what will happen. And those of you who can, and it's hard to sometimes, so it's your choice, but we know that silence is a reinforcer.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So, I'm on summer break now, or sort of, kind of on summer break. So I like to read books about stuff over the summer. And so one of the books I'm reading right now is this in my office. It's by this author named Rakesh Khurana, From Higher Aims to Hired Hands, The Social Transformation of American Business Schools and the Unfulfilled Promise of Management as a Profession.
Yeah.
Very small words, very many. But it did make me, as I'm reading this and thinking about what you're talking about, is there, in your work with sort of for-profit organizations, do you have to sort of, does an ROI justification for increasing ADEI, does that ever come up? And how do you deal with sort of, if someone's just sort of like, how does this help my shareholders?
Mm-hmm.
Does that ever come up in your work?
I mean, it has come up, and it does come up. I'm thinking all the years I've been doing this work in different ways, both academically and in my consulting work that I've done, past and current. And it's really it's being able to make that leadership case. And the leadership case really goes like this. If you, at the very basic, if you think about this as sort of building up and building out to come to this sort of multicultural organization, this inclusive organization, there's a foundation that has to be built. And that foundational element has to be strong enough for the leadership to be convinced, and for the leadership to convince their board, their constituents, the people, the community stakeholders, and so on. And that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of research out there that shows that an organization that values diversity, that has a diverse workforce, and diversity can be many things, as we saw on those slides, okay, can be many, many things, is a more enriched type of organization. And studies have shown that it's a more effective organization, a more productive organization, certainly a more innovative organization. And so that case needs to be made at the ground level before any of this other work is done. Because if you have a leadership that doesn't understand or agree or buy into that, so to speak, it's kind of a non-starter, right? So trying to build a case that people who have different socializations, come from different places, come from different cultures, come from different races, come from different gender identities, religions, they add a richness to an environment. And within each of those groups I just mentioned, there's also diversity. Not everybody who is in the LGBTQ plus community is the same. Not everyone who is in the Jewish community is the same. So understanding this rich cultural background that brings people not just to their personal lives and so on, but to their work lives, and how they approach their work, how they talk about their work, about their ideas and innovations for their work, their mission, and so on, brings richness to the organization that otherwise would be missing. That's the case right there.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because I teach the marketing strategy class, and one of the things I absolutely try and explain to the students a lot is, first off, the market is not very heterogeneous. It's a very diverse market, and the more diverse your organization is, the better you can reflect your potential customers. And then the other thing I often say, and this is something that I have to say to undergrads more than MBAs, but is that typically you are not your target market. And so being able to look empathically at the market is something that I think that is something that organizations that value AEDI just do better. And so they're able to sort of create opportunities and create value for a wider net of customers by having that sort of inclusion net or that inclusion focus within their organization. So
I think you're absolutely right on. And a real eye-opener for organizations that are interested in doing this to make this case is just pull up the US Census statistics for the last 20 years and see what's happened over the last 20 years in the United States. Because really, whether you're a believer in this or you're not quite yet on the train, the issue of a heterogeneous society in America is real. And if you just want to talk practical issues about your client constituent, you either learn how to market toward a diverse audience where they feel that they're important and included and honored and respected just like anybody, because everybody should feel that way. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a product or a service or a program that your organization puts out that exudes that, they'll probably not come looking for you, right?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right there. Now, I mean, I actually have, I'm sure I'm going to butcher this thought, but it was somewhere around the like culture precedes the market, which precedes the politics. And so if you sort of want to see where the market and the politics are going, you look at the culture now. And I think that just really shows how important it is for organizations to really value this. This has been great. I want to thank our wonderful speaker, Dr. Sue Gunther-Schlesinger, and from all of us at Western Washington University and from the MBA program at the College of Business and Economics, we want to thank all of you for joining us today. We also want to thank the Western Washington University Alumni Association for their partnership. They kind of do everything in the back end for us. And we want to thank all of those of you who have supported the MBA program and the Alumni Association over the years. And we particularly want to thank you all for attending today. So 2 more things. Number 1, Dr. Sue, if our friends in the webinar wanted to contact you, could they do that, and how should they do that?
Absolutely. They're more than welcome to contact me at my email, SUE like Sue, G as in golf, S as in Sam, or G like in Gunter, S as in Schlesinger. So SUEGS@msn.com. I'd be glad to answer any questions or provide additional resources. And it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much, and appreciate it.
Great. And one more thing. So this has been recorded, and part of what we do with the recording is we don't put it up right away, because we get we do a closed captioning of this so that more people can see it. But the recording of this webinar will be emailed out in the next couple of days. So please check your email soon for the link. We're got this momentum with these monthly webinars, but we decided to actually take a break in August because lots of people are traveling. So our next one will be Wednesday, September 20th. Put it on your calendars, or yeah, 20th, 21st, the Wednesday. But that will be the first day of classes for the fall quarter, so you can sort of feel like you're back on campus if you come to that. So thanks again for attending, and we shall talk to you all soon. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you.